During the early part of the space race between the Soviet Union and the United States, two organizations competed for space-related activity in the United States, NASA and the U.S. Air Force. While NASA would become the dominant player, the U.S. Air Force turned to more secretive missions focused on reconnaissance operations. As part of this work, the U.S. Air Force, not burdened with the goal of lunar missions, proposed a space station, the Manned Orbital Laboratory, using repeated 30-day crewed missions aboard the orbiting station. The U.S. Air Force spent years developing the project, but budget cuts forced the program to be canceled in June of 1969, at least publicly. The fact is, it wasn't, and instead became the secret station. The orbital laboratory, developed by the U.S. Air Force, went back to an alternative proposal for the Dinosaur manned reconnaissance vehicle in the early 1960s. Eventually, the design was based around the Titan III launch vehicle, which would launch a station with a habitability volume of 11.3 meters squared, utilizing a modified Gemini, the Gemini-B, with a rear docking adapter as the crew vehicle. The next issue was deciding on a launch facility. To do proper reconnaissance, the MOL would use a polar orbit, meaning launching from Cape Canaveral would prove too dangerous or arduous. So the U.S. Air Force chose the Vandenberg Air Force Base Space Launch Complex 6 in California. The first launch of the MOL, a test flight, wasn't launched from Vandenberg, but instead from Cape Canaveral Space Launch Complex 40 on November 3, 1966, on a Titan IIIC. The flight consisted of an MOL mock-up built from a Titan II propellant tank and a Gemini spacecraft number 2, which had been refurbished as a prototype Gemini-B spacecraft. The first time an American spacecraft intended for human spaceflight had flown in space twice, albeit without a crew either time. While still suborbital, the Gemini-B spacecraft separated for a re-entry test of its heat shield, a heat shield that had a hole in it, which is how the crews were to access the station. The Gemini capsule re-entered successfully and was recovered near Ascension Island in the South Pacific. The laboratory mock-up entered a 300-kilometer orbit and remained in orbit until its orbital decay 2 months later in early January 1967. Work then started on the Titan IIIM, the launch vehicle specifically designed to launch the MOL. The Titan IIIM was similar to the Titan III variant already in use, but used a stretch core stage given the extra weight of the station. Several tests were conducted of the Titan IIIM in early 1970, though by then the MOL had officially been cancelled, and it suffered delays due to complications with elements of the observational equipment, thus moving its original launch schedule back several years. There was some urgency felt by the U.S. Air Force going into 1971, as it wanted to be sure that the launch of an operational MOL would occur before the launch of the Soviet Salyut 1 station, thereby allowing the U.S. to retain the title of space race leader, albeit not publicly. With this rush in mind, the U.S. Air Force decided to launch the first mission of the MOL program in April 1971, betting on the success of the Gemini-B on the 1966 flight and the Titan IIIM tests recently conducted. Due to continued delays with the readiness of the observational instruments, the MOL mission changed slightly and would launch without those equipment, necessitating the addition of a docking adapter to allow additional modules to be added. This change would allow further developments and improvements to be launched as new modules and added to the station as they became ready. This change meant that not only would the ML be the first space station, but it would also be the first modular station as well. On April 15, 1971, the MOL-1 launched from Vandenberg.
Now 1 minute and counting. T-minus 50 seconds and counting. T-minus 35 seconds. T-minus 25 seconds. We're now primarily on an automatic sequence in the blockhouse, monitoring the final functions as they occur. T-minus 15. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition.
The two UA-1207 solid rocket boosters had enough power to launch the entire vehicle without the main engine lighting. A minute and 32 seconds after liftoff, just before the two solid rocket boosters burnt out and were jettisoned, the LR-87 main core engines ignited. Nearly 4 minutes later, the LR-87 main engines cut off, and the second stage, the LR-91, burned for 3 more minutes before the MOL reached its nearly circular polar orbit of just 180 kilometers above the Earth. This low orbit would allow higher resolution imaging, but demand constant orbital adjustments to forestall uncontrolled re-entry. Upon reaching orbit, the crew conducted systems checks and opened the rear hatch of the Gemini-B. It took nearly 2 hours to fully power up the station, but all the components worked as planned, and the crew began their 30-day mission. The secret station was up and running.